Hello everybody, this is Fernando, and I thought I would add another entry when it comes to my Urban Legends YouTube channel. This time having to do with one of the weirdest urban legends out there that actually is 100% true, and this has to do with the gaming industry. The urban legend goes that there were millions of unsold copies of E.T., the Atari video game, that were dumped in a landfill somewhere in the US, and it comes out that it's true. There are unsold cartridges that Atari essentially got permission to dump in a huge landfill and buried it with concrete, and as of right now they're somewhere there. It looks like in a town called Alamogordo, New Mexico, that is pretty much there for all to see if someone were able to check it out. Now, how the urban legend started was it had to do with the crash that occurred in the gaming industry in the early 80s. As hard as it sounds to believe now, with the popularity of so many video game consoles out there, there was a time that the video game industry was even larger then, but it spectacularly crashed in the early 80s, so much so that companies went bankrupt practically almost overnight. And I know it's hard to believe now with all the raging success, but it did happen. And when that happened, that's when it led to this urban legend of these cartridges being dumped, these unsold cartridges. It all started, it looks like, in the early 80s, around 1982. Back then, Atari was so huge that they owned actually 80% of the video game market. That's unheard of now. And like if PlayStation or Nintendo, if they owned 80% of the market, that would be groundbreaking stuff. But in terms of that, back then that was what Atari essentially owned, and they were doing so well that when it came to 1982 and they had to report their latest earnings, you can only grow so much. Eventually you come to a point where things stop growing as fast as they did before, and Atari reported apparently only a 10% increase in higher earnings, not the 50% that analysts were expecting. And so because of that, everybody started selling Atari, the stock itself. And when that happened, by the next day, Warner Brothers, which owned Atari at the time, had its stock plummet by 2/3 of its value. 2/3. In other words, 66% of its stock value declined the next day because of that. And with everything happening, Warner Brothers decided to finally sell Atari, and Atari was stuck with all these losses. So what led to those losses and the video game crash was actually several factors. At that time, whenever you had so much success in the video game industry, the people that created the games, in this case the programmers, felt that they were not valued as much as they should be, and so many of them were leaving the video game industry altogether, either to work for some other company in a different field, or to start one of their own businesses within the same industry. But that led to the loss of talent, and when you have loss of talent, then you get shoddy products. Then that means that those products aren't going to sell. Atari was also in the weird business model where they were expecting their consoles to be sold really, really cheap. The idea being that if they sell enough consoles, people will buy the video game cartridges, and those cartridges will be the ones that will be expensive. So they were counting on the video game cartridges to support them. But it's kind of like that saying, the cartridge, or instead of the horse leading the wagon, it's the wagon leading the horse in this case. And they're expecting the video games to pretty much produce them, when really you need the actual consoles themselves to sell well first in order to sell the video games afterward. And then also what led to this factor as well was that Atari was rushing many games ahead of time to actually meet deadlines, rather than ensuring that that there's quality instead of quantity. And the biggest factor on this has to do with a game that is notorious for causing the entire collapse, and actually the video game that encompasses most of the landfill, and that is E.T., the video game. I know, as strange as it sounds, that movie that was #1 for the longest time, the highest grossing film of all time for so many years, it actually had a video game that is also considered one of the worst video games of all time. And the reason for it leads back to one of my earlier reasons. Atari was such in a rush to get this video game out by Christmas, considering the success the movie had. They wanted to make sure that everybody would be able to buy an E.T. the video game cartridge for Christmas, that they rushed the game and it was produced in a matter of weeks, as opposed to a couple of months to a couple of years that it usually took an Atari game to be produced. And because of it, the people that made the video game did it with such bad quality. I mean, you can look up any YouTube video, and I'll include some images here, but if you see the video game, the images, you can see why this video game bombed so badly. It was so repetitive. Graphics, even for an Atari game back then, were horrible, and the gameplay was absolutely horrid. It was something that anybody that was an avid video gamer at the time, who would probably spend $30-$40 for this game, would probably throw the game out immediately or demand a refund. And that's essentially what happened. Once the video game came out, Atari was so sure that this video game would sell so well that they produced 5 million copies of this game. 5 million cartridges were produced ahead of time. That's how sure that they were that this game would sell out left and right. But when it came back, and all the reviews came back, and it was doing so horrible, and 5 million copies never sold, then all of a sudden Atari was stuck, because the distributors were sending the games back to them. This, along with the fact that a Pac-Man game was also rushed straight from the arcade to the home video console, and that led to 5 million other cartridges also being sent back to Atari. So now you had the unique situation where Atari has around 10 million cartridges, unsold video games, and what are they going to have to do with it? Well, they figured out that the best way to, instead of rather selling these things at a huge discount and selling them one at a time, they just decided to essentially put them in a landfill, and that's where the urban legend comes from. And most of the, according to the legend, most of the video game cartridges again have to do with E.T. Atari was able to, I guess, scrap some of the other ones and use them for other machine parts, for other cartridges and so forth, but E.T. was the one that got the distinction of being placed in the landfill. And those that have been trying, or thought, maybe I'll just go visit the landfill and take a photo. This is the only known photo that you'll see here of the landfill itself before it was buried. The problem is, right after it was buried, it was poured with concrete over it to ensure that nobody had access to it. So nobody has been able to confirm this urban legend 100%, but we do have newspaper articles that pretty much state what occurred. Now, interesting bit of news, and it's actually very good timing. It looks like the area that the cartridges were again dumped at, which is a place called Alamogordo in New Mexico, they have just granted permission for a Canadian film company to do a documentary on this legend. And it's enough of a permission for them to actually excavate the Atari land site itself and produce a documentary on it, and probably showcase how the land site looks today, and take a look and see what happens to these video games after they're there for about 30 years of essentially being buried underground. So very, very fascinating. When this documentary comes out, I'll be sure to let everybody know, and I'll post just a quick notice again up here. But yeah, that's the urban legend. It is 100% true. There are millions of unused video game cartridges, most of them having to do with E.T., currently buried within the United States, and that is again in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Quite an urban legend. This is the kind of stuff that if it wasn't real, you would think it would be made up. So, alright everybody, thanks again, take care, bye.